Hi folks, welcome to week 2. Our purpose of this week is really to come to a basic understanding of all the different types of IP law. So rather than going through each individual one in depth in sequence, our approach this week is really to start with an overview of everything, to try and make sure that you understand what copyright is, what patents are, what legislation applies to each of them, and then where we can start to explore some of the areas in which those overlap. The workshop itself this week is a brainstorming task, and the task really focuses on the idea of pitching ideas for new business properties that have a cluster of IP rights attached to them. You would have seen this during the preparatory material this week, that there's a substantial amount of overlap between different areas of IP law, and this is a good way of actually exploring some of the similarities and differences between those. So vital for this week and very useful for the rest of the course is the IP Australia website. Heaps of great materials. Their introductory materials to the various parts of different forms of IP law are much better than anything a textbook would offer. They're accurate, up-to-date, concise, and really to the point. And have a look at the example on their site of the Victor mower. Because that's an excellent example of where IP rights may overlap, and they've even included plant breeders' rights in there, which is pretty good going. So that's the inspiration really for the workshop this week, is that idea of overlap and teasing out those differences. So to do this week, you'll need to know the different areas of law that are IP law. As I said, IP Australia, much better introduction than anything a textbook would offer you, although there are certainly textbooks out there if you want to look at some of the stuff in more detail. So the three big main areas are copyright, patents and trademarks, and registered designs. Sorry, that makes 4. Trademarks are not really property as such, and again, one of the weird things about IP law is we use the property metaphor to explain legal rights, but sometimes the property metaphor doesn't really work. Also in this area there are a number of you'll see minor rights, minor pieces of legislation such as circuit layouts, plant breeders' rights and geographical indicators, and we'll also have moral rights that fit in with a subset of copyright. Of course, there are other areas of law that also apply here. So contract law, licensing, passing off, confidentiality and defamation, misrepresentation, negligence. There's a whole lot of torts that can apply as well. So make sure that you remember those areas. You've should have studied most of these before. We're going to talk about them again, so don't worry too much if you don't remember them. But we're also going to look at those in the ways that rights can overlap between IP law and other areas of law. So the real intention behind this workshop is to develop that taxonomy for yourself, to put all the pieces together, to understand the basic structure of how IP law works. So then as the semester progresses, we're going to look in focus issues in some of those key areas. And to do that, we really need to make sure we've got those foundations there first. There's a few questions here, and they're in the preparatory materials as well. And they're, I guess, guidance to when you're doing your preparation, when you're reading the materials, to make sure you've got a handle on what you're looking for. So for each of the different areas of IP law, you need to know what's the purpose, what's it supposed to do, what's it supposed to protect, what's its governing legislation, what forms of property are included, what's excluded. The definitions here are very, very important. Is registration required? What happens with registration? How long is IP protected for? What's required in the registration process? And who has rights? Who can bring litigation? Who can enforce rights? And so on. There's a whole series of questions there. And if you make notes as you go, you'll probably find that you'll see a whole series of similarities and differences across the different areas of IP law. This is just preliminary though. Remember, we're just setting out the broad brushstrokes. We're going to zoom in for more detail later. In terms of legislation, some guidance here on working with the legislation. There's a lot of legislation in this area, and a lot of it's long. So make sure you download copies of it all, so it's all to hand. That's the first thing. I wouldn't print out all the legislation because there's so much of it. But what I would do, and this is usually a good tip for when you're starting in any area of law, is to print out the index. Because usually the index, the section titles will give you a pretty good idea of what the different sections do, and the as do the part titles. And what you need to do is actually start putting together how that piece of legislation works. What are the components? What do the parts do? How do they relate to each other? Think of legislation as being a little engine, a little machine. How does it all go together? You'll see some of the stuff this week is some of the legislation, say the Copyright Act, is a bit of a broken machine. There's stuff all over the place, and there's patches and add-ons and so forth, and it really is due for a major revision. So don't let that daunt you, though. That in itself is interesting. When you hit a piece of legislation that's not user-friendly, that's not set out well, it tells you something about its history. It tells you something about what it does, and it also tells you something about how well it works today. So you can make a rough map using those section titles, how the whole thing works together. Make sure you check that if you're going to read any section, probably the definition section's a good area to start. And when you're looking at the definitions and when you're looking at the index altogether, look out for special terminology. For instance, copyright, you'll see the term fair dealing used a lot. Now that's obviously significant. So we need to think, well, where is that defined? How is it used? All these questions are useful, I think, anytime you start to approach a new piece of legislation for the first time. So, are you ready for the workshop? First of all, are you reasonably sure of the big picture? How all the different bits of IP law fit together? I've quite deliberately not gone and given you definitions of everything, because this is something it's easy to do for yourself, and I think it's something that is certainly an important process for you to be able to put the pieces together. Have a look at the mind map that's linked into Moodle, and in that mind map there's a place where you can edit it, you can add more things. So it's just a series of examples of the different forms of IP law. Chuck in some more examples. If everyone puts a few in there, then we'll start building up a big list, and we'll also start seeing that how some of the really how those differences and similarities work when they're applied. And also for the workshop this week, think about some of those products we might be discussing. So as you will have seen, the discussion this week is really about those overlapping rights and products that those apply to, but we're going to need some examples to get us going. So jot down a few ideas of yourself. Your colleagues will also have ideas, and we'll certainly have enough to get going with. But so you don't get sort of blocked and stumped to start with, make sure you've got a couple of examples to think of before we go in. Okay, so that's the overview. If you've got any questions about the preparation or the workshop for this week, send me an email, and I will see you in the tutorial.